As you look at the screen, I don't know if you've ever been here. Do you know what that's saying? You are standing between the rock and what? And the hard place. You ever been at that place in your life? There have been times that I think all of us have been there, and it becomes a lesson, and you go, Lord, what do you want me to do? If I do this, yeah, I'm in trouble. And if I do this, I'm in trouble. Sometimes, as we begin, one of the first things I want you to catch is it's not always a choice between A or B. Sometimes we want to reduce it down to that. And a lot of times when people meet with me, you know what they say? Pastor, I just need your advice. Should I do this or should I do this? And I say, well, what about that? Oh, I never thought of that. They've reduced it down to one or two things, and with one or two things, there's difficulty. If they go this way, there's difficulty. If they go this way, there's difficulty. And sometimes, if somebody came into me and said, Pastor, I don't know, should I marry her or should I marry her? Should I marry him or should I marry him? You know, if you reduce it down to two people, I say, there's a third option here. You don't have to get married. Oh, but I want to get married. Do you understand what we do? We often put ourselves, our own choices often put us in between a rock and a hard place. Do you remember this guy? His name is Aaron Ralston. Aaron is an avid climber. He just loves the outdoors. He lives in the Utah area, and so he loves going on the mountainsides. The pastor of the Audrey's home church, the pastor who's there now in Illinois, he loves to climb. And his goal is to climb all the summits in Colorado. And so every year he tries to go back, or every other year goes to a region and climbs another summit peak. And now he's gotten so he takes 6 or 8 people with him from that church. So I was thinking, maybe we ought to start doing that, don't you think? And who wants to volunteer to go with me? No, I'm not going to go. This guy loves to climb. He has, in April of 2003, Aaron Ralston entered Utah's Blue John Canyon by himself. Now here he has a policy. His policy was, never go by yourself in a canyon. Secondly, 2 guidelines that he always had: never go by yourself, and secondly, wherever you go, no matter how many people are going with you, always write a detailed plan of, we're planning on doing this, and we're planning on going here, and we're planning on going here, and we're planning on being back by this time. So that if somebody says, they're not back by this time, then what? You begin to say, we never look for him. He's left instructions. Here's where they're going to be. So let's, if there's any, somebody gets lost in the canyons, we know where to go. April 2003, to be exact, April 26, 2003, happened to be on a Saturday. And he was free, and nobody else was available to get out there and to do the climbing with him. And so he puts the pack together and gets ready and violates his first kind of guideline: never go out alone. And he says he's going to go out a mountain into the canyons alone. Secondly, because it was just kind of last minute stuff, he didn't write down what he's going to do because he hadn't really planned. He'd gotten his backpack together, and he's going to go out and just have a good time together. And he's been around this area before, so he knows what he's kind of doing. So he violated both of his guidelines: never go alone, and always write something down. Didn't do either one of those. He goes to the Blue John Canyon, and while he's there, he's climbing down into the canyon walls, and at one point he steps onto a boulder, and it looks like it's been wedged in, but you never know. The rocks have come off other canyon areas and fallen into things, and there might be some movement in that canyon. So he's on this boulder, and he's going to jump off the side and go down further. Here's how he describes it. He's a a speaker today, a motivational speaker. You know how he describes it? He said, I was on that boulder, and I was going to jump down off the boulder. He said, maybe you can liken it to this. He said, if you were on top of a basketball rim, now you're 10 feet in the air, and you want to jump down from there, do you just go jump off and jump down 10 feet and have it kind of ruin your knees and your ankles and everything else? Or do you climb down around the side as much as you can, grab on the edge of the rim, and then stretch down as far as you can? If you're 5 feet tall, at least you only have a 5-foot drop at that point. So that's what he decided to do. He said, I had this boulder, and I go to the edge of the boulder, and I lower myself down on the side. And so he said, now I'm hanging on this boulder with my hands, and I'm going to lower myself as far as I can to drop lower down to the canyon when the boulder starts to shift. And so it starts to move toward him. Later on, because of the research they'd done on it, the boulder was over 800 pounds. So now the boulder starts to roll towards him, and he drops down, and he thinks, oh no, and so he puts his hands up to kind of to block it, and it hits against his left hand against the wall, and then bounces off there. I hit my changer here. It bounces off his left hand and to his right hand, and pins his right hand against the wall. So now, the second thing I was going to put on there is from midday, Saturday, April 26th, until midday, Thursday, May 1st, Aaron was pinned between a boulder and a canyon wall. Now, he had water with him. I mean, he's an avid climber, so he knew I'm going to take water and food and that kind of stuff. But he's just pinned there, and he's thinking. Now, obviously, when I was thinking of the sermon and David, I came to the conclusion, David has really put himself between a rock and a hard place. So now I'm going on the internet saying, okay, rock and a hard place. Is there something a rock and a hard place? And this guy ends up writing a book. What do you think the name of the book was? Between a rock and a hard place. Of course, what happened while he was there and by himself and nobody knew where he was, he ended up having to cut his own hand off to get free. I won't go into the details of that. But for 127 hours, he was there. And here's his picture with the book that he wrote, Between the Rock and the Hard Place. You can see his right hand, of course, is an artificial limb at this point, because he had to cut his arm off there. At one point, he thought, I'm not going to make it out of here. I'm between a rock. I'm literally between the greatest rock and the hard place that anybody could ever be. I'm going to die. And nobody's going to know. He's got a videotape recorder, so he takes that out and he records a message to his parents. Obviously, they've edited everything out, but I want you to see the front end and the back end to catch the realism of this. Just 20-some seconds here where he says who he is, who his parents are, where they live, and appeals to whoever finds this if they would get this to his parents. And then he expresses thanks, and then they go off. Here's what he says.
My name's Aaron Ralston. My parents are down on Larry Ralston of Englewood, Colorado. Whoever finds this, please make an attempt to get it to them. Be sure of it. I would appreciate it.
I can't imagine. If I go back and say to you now, you ever been in between a rock and a hard place? Nothing like that. You have been, let's see, if I make this decision, this is the problem with that. And if I make this decision, I got a problem over here. What do I do, Lord? Let me put this on the screen and say it this way. Some choices in life can put you between a rock and a hard place. You know, I make a choice and you choose this job. And then you complain about this job that you have. And you make a choice and you choose this mate. And then you complain about the mate you have. And you make a choice and you move to Palmdale. And you complain about the heat. And you make a choice and you... Do you understand? I mean, we have choices that we can make all the time. And sometimes those choices put us between a rock and a hard place. And here's what happens. David, in the text that we're looking at today, makes some choices. And those choices put him in between a rock and a hard place. And let me give you 4 choices that culminate in today's text. They're not just from 1 Samuel chapter 29, but they lead up to it. You know, this choice leads to this choice, which leads to this choice, which ultimately culminates in this choice. And after a while, you think, what can I do? Let me show you some choices that David made. David chose to go to Gath. Now, let me remind you that Gath was where the Philistines lived. They were enemies of Israel, enemies of David. David had killed Goliath, who grew up in Gath. And now David wants to move to the area where Goliath lived. Oh, I understand. I just want you to know I'm the guy that killed your hero. I'm the guy that, led the battle against you guys. He chose to go there. Let me go back in the text. In 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 1, it says this. David said to himself, one of these days I'll be swept away by Saul. Remember, King Saul is after him. King Saul keeps after him. And wherever David could turn, if Saul knew he was there, Saul went after him to attempt to kill him. Saul would never find him. David found Saul on at least 2 occasions and could have taken his life, but spared his life. At this point, David said to himself, one of these days I'll be swept away by Saul. I'll be killed by Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape immediately to the land of the Philistines. Remember what I said? We often reduce our decisions down to we can do A or we can do B. Right? I'm thinking, David, really? Is it down to A or B? Is it down to 1 or 2? I do this decision or I do this decision? How about, is there a third decision? What could he have done? Let's see. He could have stayed in Israel, but if he stays in Israel, who's after him? Saul is after him. If he goes to the Philistine area, who's after him there? The Philistines. So either one of those decisions seemed like a dumb decision to me to go right there. Where is he currently living? In the desert. He's in Palmdale. Does he have to move from Palmdale? No. What if he said, I'm not going to be back in Israel where Saul can get me, and I'm not going to go to the Philistines where the Philistines can get me. How about if I just live here in the cave of Adullam? Oh yeah, no showers, not much food. It is kind of bad. But isn't that better than going back where Saul can kill him, or going to the Philistines where Achish and others can kill him? Why would you reach this conclusion? I'm going to escape and go to the land of the Philistines. I didn't say this the last hour, but let me say this. Parents, and I never know why God has me say some things like this. I just assume at this point the Holy Spirit is saying some parent needs to be reminded of this. And so what I'm going to say to you is this. Your kids are going to bring you decisions. And their decisions are going to be, do I do this or do I do this? Remind them that it's not always just this or this. Again, there might be that you can do. Don't let them frame. Whoever frames the argument and the debate gives you a box. And I want you to think outside the box where God is. Don't put him in. Don't let your kids put you into a box and then say, tell me what to do, tell me what to do. And then you don't know what to do. And then when you tell them what to do and it doesn't work out, you're to blame. Do you follow that? So at this point, began to say, I tell you what, there's a third option here. And instead of doing A or instead of doing B, let's do C right now and wait on the Lord. And see what God does in this process. Now, there might be a time where A or B has to be done within 10 seconds or 10 minutes or 10 hours or something. But most of the time, the decisions you make don't have to be made immediately. So wait on the Lord and let him renew your strength and give you that focus. At this point, he says, it's better for me to escape immediately to the land of the Philistines. Look at the next phrase there. Then Saul will stop searching for me everywhere in Israel, and I'll escape from him. Well, that's true. You can get away from Saul, but when David gets away from Saul and he's free from there, he'll be in the hand of the enemy. Who wants him dead more than anybody else? He's just killed their main leader, Goliath. They think nothing better than to kill him. Verses 2 and 3, chapter 27. So David set out with his 600 men and went to Achish, son of Maach, king of Gath. David and his men stayed with Achish in Gath. Each man had his family with him, and David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. This isn't the first time David's gone down to Gath. This is the second time. You'd think after going to the enemy the first time, and by the way, when he went down there the first time, if I use this expression, will you understand what I mean? He went down there the first time and it all went sideways. What do I mean when it all went sideways? It wasn't like I'm here and it's progressing and we're going forward with this. All of a sudden it's all going sideways and he's going, what do I do? And remember, he was down there and they recognized that he was David. And they recognized, he's the guy that killed Goliath. We need to get after him. And he was so, now what do I do? And so he started clawing at the doors, the gates, and letting saliva run down his beard. Here's the text the first time he went down. 1 Samuel 21, verse 10. David fled that day from Saul's presence and went to King Achish of Gath. But Achish's servants said to him, isn't this David, king of the land? Don't they sing about him during their dances? Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Verse 12, David took this to heart and became what? Very afraid of the king of Gath, King Achish of Gath. It starts to go sideways on him. Can I say, listen, look at me. Can I say this? At that point, he was between a rock and a hard place. Right? Isn't that what happened the first time he went down? He thought, I'll just leave and then I'll be free of all this. Did it free him of it? Not at all. As a matter of fact, you know how long he was down in the Philistine territory? David was in the Philistine territory from 1 Samuel 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, and 2 Samuel chapter 1. 6 chapters in our study, he's down in the Philistine territory. He was down there 1 year and 4 months with his troops. And he thinks, I'm going to get out of my problems. And instead, what did he do? Well, let me say it this way. Why was David put in this difficult place? What happened in his life that did he live in sin or something? Had he made, some really horrific blunder and God was going to punish him? No. David was in this difficult situation because David chose to be in that difficult situation. David chose to go to Gath. God didn't say, go to Gath. This is the place where I want you to go. Instead, he runs down there and thinks, I'm going to be safe. And instead, he's in problems. Again, it wasn't the first time, and there are some similarities between the two times that he went down to Gath, between the first and second time. Let me slide it down and put this. The first time, David was fearful. He began to waver in his faith. And so where'd he go? He ran to where? Gath. Chapter 21. While he was in Gath, and the reason he ran from Gath is Saul wanted to kill him, right? So in chapter 22, you have a second part that goes on while David's in Gath. Saul rejects the Lord, and he kills the priests of the Lord in Nob. How many priests does he kill? 85 of them. He rejects the Lord. Did you catch that? Saul rejects the Lord, and he kills the priests. Chapter 23 now, David gets out of Gath, and he hears that the people at Keilah need help. And so he seeks the Lord. And here's this. The Lord guides David. He seeks the Lord and says, Lord, should I go over to Keilah and help them or not? David is given guidance by the Lord, and the Lord gives him victory at Keilah. That's the first time he's down at Gath. Look at the second time and see the comparison to what's going on. The second time, David is fearful and ran where? Does anything look familiar at all? It looks like the same thing's going on, doesn't it? What happens the first time? He gets fearful, his faith wavers, and he runs. What happens the next time? He gets fearful, his faith wavers, and he runs. But the second time he's down there, it changes in part B here. The first time, Saul rejects the Lord. See B up there? It's in gray right now. Let me highlight that. Saul rejects the Lord. But in the second time, the Lord rejects Saul. The first time, Saul kills 85 of the priests. He rejects the Lord, kills the priests. This time, God rejects Saul and says, you're going to be killed tomorrow. Similar, but with a twist. When you get to the third part of when he's in Gath, here's what happens. The Lord guides David and gives victory, and it's the same. Chapter 23, in Keilah, God gives him victory. In chapter 30, God gives victory over the Amalekites. Look, some choices in life can put you between a rock and a hard place. There are 4 of them that culminate in today's text. First, David chose to go to Gath. Why was he between the rock and a hard place? Because he chose it. And sometimes your family members are going to come back to you and they're going to bring you issues in their lives, and they're going to say, man, I'm really between a rock and a hard place. And you almost will want to say to them, do you realize why you're here? You chose it. Do you realize that? But sometimes you can't go there. Sometimes you just need to say, oh, honey, I'm so sorry. And you just listen. But in the back of your mind, and what you need to hear today is sometimes you choose it. I can say that to you today because nobody's telling me right now that they're between the rock and the hard place, and I don't need to show you empathy right now. I just need to tell you the truth. What's the truth? Most of the time, you choose the rock and the hard place. And then you complain because you're in the rock and the hard place. David chose to go to Gath, and then he complained about it. Let me give you another one. David chose to align himself with Achish. Who is Achish? He's the king of Gath. Now, they say there are some countries that every tribe has a chief. And so there are a lot of tribes, and there are a lot of what? Louder chiefs. There are a lot of chiefs. And so with the Philistine area, Gath was a city. And the king is usually over a country. But in this case, the king was over the area of Gath. And they had other leaders in the Philistine cities. And matter of fact, there were 5 of them. And so there are 5 cities and kind of like 5 mayors, only they were all kings. David chooses to align himself with the king of Gath. Here's the text. So David set out with 600 men and did what? Went to Achish, son of Maach, king of Gath. Really? Now, I don't know about you, listen, but if I'm going to go from my home area where I'm not so welcomed, and Saul's trying to get after me, and I go over to the enemy territory where I killed the main man, I want to go there, and can I use a term that you might not use very often, but I want to go there and be incognito. It's what some of you like to be at times, you know. I leaned in front of a little guy the last service and I said, do you know what it means to be incognito? And he goes, no, he gives me this dumb look. Don't ask me in front of my parents. I said, it means to go there stealth. What does it mean to go there stealth? It means that nobody knows who you are. You know, if the president or any former president in recent years of the United States were to come here in our service today, probably be pretty hard for him to go any place and be what? Incognito. Nobody recognizes, but they would go, hey, look, isn't that President Obama? Isn't that President Bush? Isn't that President? You know, you'd know those people. Here, David decides he's going to go down to Gath, and he thinks he's going to be incognito. He's the guy that killed Goliath. Everybody saw this little run of a guy go out and swing his sling around and bring Saul down, or bring Goliath down. So it's not going to be incognito. And so if I'm going to go to the enemy territory, doesn't it make sense that I want to go and be stealth? Why would I go and say, here's what David did? Read that text. David set out with his 600 men and went to Achish. He went right up to him. Hey, buddy, I'm David. I just wanted you to know that. Yep, I'm the guy that killed the enemy. Yep, I'm the guy that killed your main man. Yep, I just wanted you to know who I am so that I'm not safe here. Why would you do that? We make choices that sometimes what? Put us between a rock and a hard place. If David had just gone down there and kept his mouth shut and stayed out of the way, might have been one thing. But instead, look at the text again. So David set out with his 600 men and went to Achish, son of Maach, king of Gath. Verse 3, David and his men stayed with Achish in Gath. Hey, by the way, just so you know, can I stay at your house tonight? Does this sound unbelievable to you? I mean, if somebody anybody in our church just showed up at your house tonight and say, hey, can I stay at your house? Somebody would say, oh yeah, come in, honey, what's up? You know, oh, our house burned down this afternoon and we need a place to stay. Oh, stay here. But if you're the next king of Israel, and they already said he's the next king of Israel, if you're the next king of Israel and you've killed Goliath and you're going to live with the enemy and you go now and introduce yourself to the king, you're probably going to put yourself in a rock and a hard place. And then you're going to complain about it. But that's not totally what happened. Here's what happens. Each man, they stayed with Achish and Gath. Each man and his family had his family with him. And David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam and Abigail. By the time you get to verse 12 in this chapter, it says this. So Achish, what? Trusted David. Can you believe that? I mean, here's David who's killed the Philistines. He's really an enemy of them. And yet Achish trusts him. Why? Because David is not being honest with him completely. So Achish trusted David thinking, now here's what happened. David had 600 men. And some of those men, many of those men were married. So their wives are there with them. And their kids are there with them. So what do you need almost more than anything else when you have 600 men and probably 500 wives and probably at least 1,000 children? You need what? Food. And so where do you get food? You go into the nearby territories and raid those people. The nearby territories, where was he at this time? In Philistia. So the nearby territories are allies of Philistia, allies of the Philistines. And so where are you going to raid? The enemies of Israel, who are allies of Philistia, because you're living in Philistia. So here's what it says. Achish trusted David, thinking, since David has made himself detestable to his people Israel, because he's saying all along, I'm raiding Israel, I'm raiding Israel, I'm raiding Judah. But he's not raiding Israel, he's not raiding Judah, he's not raiding his own people, he's raiding the allies of the Philistines. He's made himself detestable to Israel. He will be my servant forever. Achish. I don't know. He's not a very wise king. He's been duped by David. Doesn't know what's going on. By the time you get up to chapter 28, verse 1, at that time, the Philistines brought their military units together into one army to fight against Israel. So Achish said to David, you know, of course, that you and your men must march out in the army. Where? You're going to be right there with me. Because he has chosen to align himself with Achish, with the enemy. And now he puts himself, look at what it says on the screen. Do you not understand that he's put himself between the rock and the hard place? If he is with them and he fights against his own people, will he ever become king of his people? God said he's going to be king. And if he is king of his people, what are they going to say? Oh, you fought against us. How can we trust you? Why should I go and fight in your army when you fought against us? And if he doesn't fight with the Philistines at that point, what are they going to say to him? They're going to say, we thought you were a traitor. We're going to kill you right here. And so he's what? Between what? He's between a rock and a hard place at that point. You're going to march out there with me. Right between this rock and this hard place. Who put himself there? David did. Here's the choices we make in life that'll put us there. There are 4 choices that culminate in this. David chose to go to Gath. Got him into problems. David chose to align himself with Achish, the king of Gath. Thirdly, David chose to lie about his loyalties. And here's what goes in the text. The time that David stayed in the Philistine territory amounted to 1 year and 4 months. David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. Remember, they're all enemies of the Philistines. But what does he tell King Achish? After he's raided these areas that are all friends of Achish, all the enemies of Israel, after he's raided those areas, Achish says, Where did you raid today, David? Here's what it says in the text. Verse 9, the very last part. Then David came back to Achish, who inquired of him, where did you raid today? David replied, the south country of where? Judah. The south country of the Jermelites, or against the south country of the Kenites, all friends of Israel. So he lied to him. Chapter 28, verse 1. At that time, the Philistines brought their military units together into one army to fight against Israel. So Achish said to David, you know, of course, that you and your men must march out in the army with me. David replied to Achish, good. You will find out what your servant can do. Does he ever say what he's going to do, though? You're going to find out what your servant can do. And what can this servant do? Just so you know, when they get ready to go to battle, David, let me raise this question first in your thinking, though. Will David really fight against Israel? Will he fight against the Lord's anointed? He's already said, I'm not going to raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. But now he's between the rock and the hard place. You got to go out, your troops have to go out, and you're going to go out with me. And now he lies about what he's doing. So when they get ready to go to the battle, you know where David's 600 men are? At the rear of the battle. At the rear of the army. They didn't get the battle yet. So he's at the rear of the army. And so if he's at the rear, and here are the rest of the people of the Philistines, and up here are the Israelites, you've got a situation where you got Israel on both sides of the Philistines. And what does he say? Good! You will find out what your servant can do. Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of. Does that mean you're going to fight for me? Or does that mean you're going to fight against me? And we already know. Now he's got to make a decision. What decision is he going to make, though? Some choices in life can put you between the rock and the hard place. Now, here's the interesting thing. There are 4 choices that culminate in today's text. One is David chooses to go to Gath. Secondly, David chose to align himself with Achish, the king of Gath. Thirdly, David chose to lie about his loyalties. He said, I'm going against your enemies. I'm fighting Judah, when he really wasn't. Listen to me. It's David chose, David chose, David chose. And I want you to remember, every day, you choose whether you're going to get into the Word of God, whether you're going to choose whether you spend time in prayer. You're going to choose whether you're praying for our missionaries. You're going to choose whether you're going to be faithful to your spouse. You're going to choose whether you're going to love her as Christ loved the church. You're going to make choices every day. And those choices, if wrong, are particularly going to place you between a rock and a hard place. But there's a 4th choice up here. Remember, David chose, the bottom one, David chose to go to Gath. Then David chose, the next one, to align himself with Achish. And then David chose to lie. But the 4th one, I like the best. Because let's move away from David. And David chose, and David chose, and David chose. And I want to just insert the word but God chose. And this 4th one is this. After David made all these choices, but God chose to use the same Philistines who will destroy Saul and have them save David. This is incredible, because here's what's happened. David is between the rock and the hard place. If he says, no, I'm not going to fight against Israel, then they're going to kill him. If he says, oh yeah, I'm going to fight with you guys, then he's got to fight against his own family. He's got to fight against God's chosen people. And what does God say? I will bless those that bless you, Israel, and I will curse those who curse you. So David, what are you going to do? You're between this rock and this hard place. Are you going to do it? Here's what the text says. 1 Samuel chapter 29, verses 1 and 2. The Philistines brought all their military units together at Aphek. So I want you to just kind of catch this in your thinking for a moment, because this is sometimes what's difficult in Scripture. You don't know when sometimes, let me use this term. You don't know sometimes when there's a flashback to something previously going on. Do you catch that? For instance, if I'm preaching right now, and if I am in the midst of preaching, and I say, hey, let me go back and say this, though. And then I correct something back here, and then I jump back into the current position where we are in the sermon. You let me, in your thinking, jump back and forth, because I can quickly do that. Did you know that sometimes when pastors have interpreters for the deaf, that it's very hard for them because they get their sign language from the context what's currently going on. And so they have to keep thinking in a very linear fashion. We did this first, we did this second, we did this third, we did this fourth. And you can't say, let me go back to point 1 here and think about it. They go, they're trying to put it all in context. They can't do that so quickly and so easily. But for you and for me, when I'm talking and teaching like this, sometimes I don't even have to say, let me go back and pick this up. Sometimes I can just say, hey, and I refer to something that we've already referred to, and you go, oh yeah, and you jump right back in there with me, and then we go right back to the current discussion. Anybody ever do that? You know, your wife is talking. The other day my wife said something to me, and I'm going, what? Because all of a sudden she jumped back into a conversation that we'd had before, and her thinking, you ever been there? And you're thinking you're just tracking, you've been thinking through this, and all of a sudden you think, and you jump right back into the conversation, and they go, what? What are you talking about? Oh, I was talking about this, and they remind you of a previous conversation, and then they bring you up to speed. And then, all of a sudden, you can go back to the current situation. Here's what happens in this context in chapter 29. In chapter 29, he tells you that they are where? At Aphek. And Aphek happened even before chapter 28. They've done a flashback here. And he's letting you know what has gone on during the chapter 28. Chapter 28 was when Saul went up to the witch at Endor. And they were ready to fight the battle the next day. Chapter 29 goes back before chapter 28 and says, here's what happened when they were at Aphek. So, the Philistines brought all their military units together at Aphek. This is chapter 29, verse 1. If you went back to chapter 28 and verse 4, it says this, the Philistines came together and camped at Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel and they camped at Gilboa, where the fight's going to occur. Let me show it to you on a map this way. Let's go to the globe. Let's zoom in on the Middle East area. And now let's zoom in on Israel. You can see the Dead Sea in the bottom there, the Sea of Galilee at the top. And here are the cities that are involved in chapters 28 and 29 and 30. Ramah is Samuel's. The guys that the book is named after, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Samuel's hometown, Ramah. And Saul lived right near there. Aphek, right over on the left side of your screen, about halfway up, near the Mediterranean, is where they were in chapter 29. They gather all the troops at Aphek. Now, just so you know, and it's not on here, I should have put it on here, but I didn't because it's not mentioned in this chapter. Let me put my hand on a shadow, right about here where my fist is on the screen. Just to the south and to the west, a little bit of Ramah, is where Gath is. And Gath is about 30 miles from Aphek. And Aphek is 30 miles from Shunem. Shunem is where they were in the battle. But all of a sudden they back up. So Shunem is where you are in chapter 28. They're at the battle where Saul goes to the witch at Endor. But in chapter 29, he drops back at Aphek. And he tells you what's going on. So I'm going to bring you up to speed with what's going on in chapter 29. And then you go back to Shunem in chapter 30. And you hear about this battle all over again. So here's chapter 29. The Philistines brought all their military units together at Aphek, while Israel was camped by the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine leaders were passing in review with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were passing in review behind them with Achish. You've seen this happen. You ever seen a military formal ceremony where the president of Russia and the military comes out and they all stand at attention and the president walks down and he walks and he stops and he turns and he looks at some guy and he inspects him and then he turns and walks a little further. You've seen that, right? They're going through review and they're doing this at Aphek. Here's what happens though. As the Philistine leaders were passing in review with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were also passing in review behind them with Achish. Then the Philistine commanders asked, what? What are these Hebrews doing here? What are these Jewish people? What are these Israelites doing here? We're going to go fight their families just a little bit. We ought to be killing them right here. Why are they here? That's because 5 of them, remember there are 5 cities and all of them had kings in this Philistia area? So the other 4 are going, why are these Hebrews here? Look at the text. Then the Philistine commanders asked, what are these Hebrews doing here? Achish answered the Philistine commanders, oh, that's David, servant of King Saul of Israel. Now, if you're trying to make score any points, this didn't do it. He's the servant of King Saul, and he's fighting with us. He has been with me a considerable period of time from the day he defected until today. I found no fault with him. The other 4 Philistine leaders are letting that go through their minds. Verse 4, the Philistine commanders, however, were enraged with Achish and told him, send that man back and let him return to the place you assigned him. Go back to Ziklag. He must not go down with us into battle. You catch that? Here's what I want you to understand. At this point, David is between a rock and a hard place. Does he go to battle or not? God says, David, you've gotten yourself in this problem. You did it to yourself. You chose to go to Gath. You chose to align with Achish. You chose to lie about your loyalties. But God intervenes. And how does he intervene? How does he protect David in this mess? Isn't that David they sing about during their dances? Saul has killed his thousands, but David has tens of thousands. So Achish summoned David and told him, as the Lord lives, by the way, just so you know, this is the only time the Lord's name is mentioned in this chapter. It's not mentioned at all in chapter 27. It's only mentioned once in chapter 29, and the only person that mentions it is a heathen. Who? So Achish summoned David and told him, Achish said, as the Lord lives, you're an honorable man. I think it is good to have you working with me in the camp because I have found no fault in you from the day you came to me until today. But the leaders don't think you're reliable. David's probably jumping up and down inside, going, oh, this is great. They're not going to let me go fight. That's great. Because now he's between a rock and a hard place, remember? He's got to fight his own people. And if he doesn't, he looks like he's unloyal to the Philistines. And if he does that, his people are going to be upset. But now the leaders say, we don't think you're reliable. We don't want you going to battle with us. And God graciously has these Philistine leaders let him out. Let him off the hook. Let him out between the rock and the hard place. Verse 7 says it this way. Achish says to David, now go back quietly, and you won't be doing anything the Philistine leaders think is wrong. Let me say clearly to you this. God chose to provide David a way of escape, even though David had caused his own problems. David chose Gath. David chose to align himself with Achish. David chose all that. Put himself in the problem that he had. And God said, you know something? I told you you're going to be king. I told you your kingdom would have no end because Jesus is going to be born through you. And I'm going to step in because you're my child. And I want to say to you today, some of you have put yourself in the same mess. Or let me even move it to this. Some of us. I'll put myself right there. Some of us have put ourselves, we make the decisions. And we get between the rock and the hard place. But our God says you're his child if you love him, if you trusted him. And even when it comes to sin, he says, there is no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above what you are able, but will with that also make a way to what? Escape. You might be in between a rock and a hard place today. And the question I have for you is, are you between that rock and the hard place today? God wants to say, you probably put yourself there to some extent. I want to help you out. I want to give you a way to escape. I want to learn from David, not to put myself in between the rock and the hard place, but if I put myself there, I want to learn from David to accept it so that he provides a way of escape. Would you join me in prayer? Father, thank you that you're willing to love us even when we make bad choices. Thank you that you're willing to step in and do what you do best. And giving us a way to escape so that you can use us for your glory. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.